way this is going to work is you raise your hands. If you have a question, I will call on you, and we'll have the person respond. We might not get to everyone, and I'm going to do the best I can to go in the order that I see the hands. But there's a lot of you in here, and I only have one set of eyes, and so this might have to be a collaborative effort. Awesome. Who wants to go first? Who has a question? Perfect. We'll start here.
Hey, Todd.
I was wondering if that was going to happen. I was wondering.
Been looking for you, Todd. Gonna get this work.
It's not really Todd. I knew it. Great question. Great question.
So yeah, Todd's everywhere, and the ones that I see that are there. So let me cycle back a little bit. When I first started Just Informed back in 2017, after about a year, I did an analysis of who was coming to us. Who are the people? Literally, like, who are they? Market segmentation is basically what I was doing. And what I found were three characteristics. One is that they'd been in their firm for less than 5 years, which to me translated as they still had hope that something could happen. They hadn't gotten slapped enough. Secondly, they were usually women. And third, they were usually women of color. Oftentimes, by the time they contacted me, they were usually out of the firm within a year. So they were the highest departure risk for the firm, but they were also the ones who were most willing to reach out for help because they understood truly what they'd lacked in the institution. Now, they had already committed to the work. They had already been trying to do things, and they were usually at their wits' end, and they were like, we need external help. We have $2,000 for a 5-year plan, right? So I say all that to say that when you think about who are the white people who are committed to doing this work, they have a profile. And what I've found is they're usually ones who are just coming in. They likely came in because they believed what they saw online. They're also coming in because the recruiter sold them a story that they hope is true. And now they're inside and they want to do the work. They're usually more junior in the organization. They also, when I said what I said about generations, they usually have not accumulated as much in their own lives outside of work as other people have. I'm just saying, like, the prototypes of, like, the types of people that end up coming to me. They're usually the ones who have the most at risk. They may have one or more degrees of marginality. So they may be white and LGBTQ, white and lower income, white and et cetera. And so there are different, identity markers that I find with people that create the catalyst to them being the one that comes. And it may be a personal experience, a personal identity, where they're at in their life. They just got out of college, and that was like the most diverse experience. And now they're at work, and they're like, what the hell happened? Right? Those are the ones. They also get silenced the quickest, and they end up, much like usually women of color in workplaces, they end up having to hold the effects of the curious people. That is the testimony. Their pain becomes the classroom, like I was saying. So those are the ones that I find. The ones up top are really hard to find. They are there. I get approached by, and I know a ton of white executives who really want to make change, but their biggest challenge is the other white folks, and they don't know how to go get Todd either. And so actually, tactically, I use keynotes to do that. Most people bring me in to do a keynote because they want to create a level of margin and space in their organization for a conversation that's not yet safe to have. The keynote allows for that and then creates the expectation for an actual work being done. And so that's a tactic that a lot of companies utilize oftentimes as well.
Great question. Anyone else? Don't be afraid. We'll go here, and then we'll go to the next person I see. Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm not Todd. I'm Paula. I have a question related to the action that we're all talking about. So again, we've assumed that everybody in this space is ready to move on from conversation to really substantial, direct action. And so if you are in an organization and you're ready for that, what is the first step that I'm seeing kind of a gap here, and it's conversation, action. How do you take that meaningful step as an organization to lead
question.
That is a great question. And my experience is that it requires resources that corporations are just not ready and prepared to dedicate. So going back to your comment about they want a strategic plan for $2,000, right? I would submit, like, I bet my lunch money that most of these corporations have bigger budgets for toilet paper than they have for diversity and inclusion. Legit. I mean, I will talk to these DEI leads in major Fortune 500 companies. They probably make $325,000 a year. God bless them. They probably earn every penny. But that would probably be 20% of the DEI budget. So if companies are going to get serious about this and really position themselves for action, they have to put their money where their mouths are, right? That's what it's going to take. Without, I mean, we can do marginal things. Individuals can do things. Most of it is conversations because that's really all you can do with marginal resources. But the folks at the top are going to have to, decide whether or not they're going to or get off the pot. Sorry.
Yeah, do you want to jump on? Did you want to respond to Xavier?
Yeah. A lot of people think about it like this. I think about my work as like the field of medicine. You never anybody ever gone to the doctor and be like, "Open me up now, cut it open, get it out, get what out?" Right? That's sometimes how people approach DEI. Get it out of me, get the problems out. The reality is the first step is diagnosis. There's an understanding of how do you understand the symptoms that you're dealing with. Secondly, you have to understand the rate of severity of the problem within the institution. I tend to group it in 3 different areas. One is the emergency room. Like when I'm talking with some of our DEI strategists, I'm like, all right, this client is an emergency room client. They are pre or post litigation. The last black lady left and she's been on Twitter for 4 hours. Like, this is the ER. Like code zero. Like let's go. Right. The other one is the operating room. Those are for companies and organizations that they've already gone through the assessment process. They've already had these conversations. They have an established DEI committee. They have established goals. They've already gone through certain processes, and we need to be surgical. There are specific things that we have found that are at the root of the challenge. That may be establishing will amongst their executive team. That may be understanding how to talk to their procurement department about budget. It may be a supplier diversity issue. It could be a myriad of things, but essentially what we're saying is we need to be surgical and tactical. We know exactly where the harm is coming from, and let's go in on it. The other one is preventative care. I've got a lot of clients in that space. Those are folks who are like, you know what, I just want to come in for a checkup, make sure I'm good. I had a little cough last week, but it wasn't that bad, but just want to make sure I'm good here. Right? Like those are the types of companies. They're usually starting earlier. They're younger companies usually, and they're like, hey, we just don't want to screw this up. Right? We want to make sure we're going in with the right footing. But to the point around this is I truly think the first side is, and I totally agree with the resources thing. The resources thing, however, comes once you know what you have. It's like, how much is my bill going to be for this surgery? We don't know what we're operating on yet. On the backside of that, all of these organizations need to understand what DEI actually costs when you're talking about labor. The way I explain it to people is, imagine you're getting an extra staff person who went to a school you never heard of that was Ivy League or better, and now they're on your team. What would you budget for that? Now what would you budget for materials? Now what would you budget for time? What would you budget for travel? These types of things. And work around that. And then have the conversation around the difference between dollars exchanged for time versus dollars exchanged for value. Right? The question of the severity of the challenge within your institution is often higher than the value of the exchange for labor for hours. And so when you're looking at your budget in the same way that they're trying to look at, we have these growth opportunities and we want to build our revenues, DEI companies are in the same boat. The only difference is they're often people who are actually experiencing the effects of harm while trying to help others. It's more triage than it is preventative. And so there is, what I would say, you got black folks, brown folks, trans folks doing this DEI work. Right? The reality is it actually costs them more to do it. It costs them more emotionally. It costs them more physically. It costs them more spiritually. I build that into the budget.
Yeah. Charles, too.
I think one area not to lose hope in is the fact that, yeah, we're far from where we probably want to be, and even some of these executives want to be. And I think there is a case to be made for incremental moving the needle a little bit in that direction, because like you mentioned, we do work with executives that are white, Caucasian, that have this intent, but they don't know how to deal with the Todds of the world. And that's a real thing. So I don't want to picture it where, nobody wants to be generalized. I also don't want to generalize corporate America too. because corporate America has worked hard, some companies, on this. So I don't want to just throw everybody under the bus. That's too easy. And I also don't want this conversation necessarily to give you a lack of hope, because there are people trying to make progress. And there are some companies that have significant budget. And it's a rarity, I know. But there are people trying to do this and bringing in people like yourself and others, I mean, your clients and such. So I don't want to leave this with like despair, but it should leave us with deep conviction that there's a ton of things we still ought to do. So we work with a lot of businesses in all areas of innovation. This happens to be one of those areas. And we help them pitch for better budget. We help them tell the story. And we have other clients that are true like advocacy clients that are trying to change criminal justice systems. So we work on that end, but we realize in corporate America, sometimes that, when you come straight into it, like we'll bring in hopefully people like Xavier and others, and we have, because you kind of need that to get some of the conversation going. But we also bring other types of consultants and strategists in because they know how to navigate that type of political structure. So it is a combination of multiple things. So if anything, encouragement is like people are doing that. I mean, it may start in conversation. It may start in like literally making sometimes a business case. And I don't want to come off as like the business case guy. That's my intent. My intent is really to create change. And that may be an avenue through which you got to get somewhere so that someone else can speak into the process and someone else can speak into the process. So I think there is room for us to figure out how we are going to all actually work together.
Yeah, that's good. I hear between all of you responding to that question that it's not one thing that has to happen. It's a ton of things that all have to happen all the time, which goes back to the resources to make all of those things happen all of the time. What I can do as an individual, what I can do in my employee resource group, and then who do we need to bring in. It's a lot of different things. We have time for a couple more questions. We'll go. Well, there was one up here, and then I'm going to come down to you, Hazen, and then I'm going to come over here to Martine. You have to be loud. I'll repeat it if I have to.
No, I agree. And I mean, whether fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of those types of companies that you're talking about are answering to shareholders, which probably, is a broader question of like where we're investing, right, in our stock portfolio. So there are other choices you can make in how you put up a portfolio. It's the irony is we may have a 401k and we're investing in companies that may not carry this value, but it's in our retirement. And so I think, so in their case, like making a case is like, it sounds very superficial. I get it. It's very capitalistic. But I feel like my thought is sometimes when you solve a problem that's over here, you can't solve it right now, but you got to get it to a certain angle so you have a line of sight to solve that. So I feel like my role is that, hey, if I can make a business case to say this will actually make you more profitable, and I know that irks people the wrong way sometimes, unless it's us, right? So if you make that case, but if that opens up a new type of culture that maybe the profitability comes from like retention or talent acquisition, all these elements that run businesses. So if that happens, at least there will be it may not be the ideal, and I would say it's far from ideal, but maybe it is a step to solving it more long term. Mm-hmm. And so will this do more harm for corporate America? Maybe. I don't know that. But what I can say is that, hey, maybe part of this conversation is because it's really complicated. Like, I heard earlier, some of our comments are really U.S. based. We work with diversity internationally, and it's a different conversation. And so I think part of it is because we are so centered, regardless of race, in our country, and naturally so, because that's all we know. So the irony is like, and sometimes I sit on panels around diversity and I feel like I'm like the fourth wheel. It's a white and black conversation, and rightly so at many levels. So I'm not ignoring that. But there's a Latino conversation, and then Asians are just kind of quiet over here because we're really just like good model workers that are middle management. We don't see Asians in C-suite as much either. So I think broadening our perspective to say, because when we work with European companies, their diversity is different. Like, you go to a place like Norway and they have like a national like commitment to hire from within their country. And so it's just kind of it's complex. That's why we need to approach from certain angles. Sometimes the answer will be really bad for that question. Other times it feels like, hey, we made progress. So I don't know how to answer it, but I can tell you, and I can end up in both of those scenarios, but I'm going to have to try to figure out how to do that versus expecting them to change, because I don't know how that's going to happen without the first incremental step.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. All right, right here, Hazen.
So the question I want to ask is, how do you think in the political landscape, the fragmentation and then the polarization of parties, but even subsets within the parties, has complicated but also galvanized the conversation around race and diversity?
Did y'all hear that question? Okay, great. Anyone can jump in.
No, go ahead. One thing that I'll say, so last year, I've been like really pushing hard to try and understand and like level up my thinking about things. And where I think it's helpful, there were 6 or 7 books I read last year. All were prompted by Trump's election. Him getting into office prompted people to speak out who, for some reason, I have no clue why, didn't do it in that way before. And because I read them in succession, right, there's like this pattern that I'm like, whoa, holy cow, I have access now to content that did not exist before this fractioning started to happen socially. And the reality is it didn't just start happening, right? Let's be clear. But kind of the silver lining in all of this is it brings it to the forefront of people's consciousness. And what's great, because of the world that we live in today, is information can spread fast, right? And I think that while terrible things are happening globally, and I don't want to overlook that by any means, it is elevating the conversation in people's minds. And what I love personally is that it forces you to pick sides. You cannot just sit still. Congratulations. If you do, your side is on that of the status quo and the way that it's always been. And I think when it's kind of silently working in the background, it doesn't feel that way. And so, yeah, in a lot of ways, like there's just content that is available now that it can reach people in a way that I don't want to say it hasn't before, because I talked to a friend of mine, a woman of color, and she was like, Morgan, there are thousands of books about this. Yeah. You're right. There are. But for some reason, and I don't know why, I did not intersect them in quite this way, right? And you can make an incredible case that silence was always being complicit in this. You're right. Like, these are all true things, right? But I think what's great today is like, yeah, you can't pick sides, and everything, like information spreads so fast. And yeah, so it's like, okay, well, we have access to things today that, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was just different. I read Ray Kroc's autobiography, and I think he published it like 30 years ago. And I'm like, this is not history. But I read it, and like halfway through, I'm like, man, I kind of respect this guy. And then I'm like, wait a minute, what? Right, but you could get away with that in a way that today you just can't. And so I think it's beautiful, and then also should put people on their toes a little bit.
Yeah, I struggle with this so much, and especially as to what I can say, because I'm a fundraiser and I need money from both people, and you're like tiptoeing around what you're allowed to say, and then what should you like donor over dignity, like what are you allowed to say? But I think what you were saying, like the silver lining is we are aware of problems that it's easy for us to blame Trump for, but in reality, he's kind of the reason that we know it exists for a lot of us who haven't lived it. Like what you were saying, like we never have to choose things because of our race. The first time I heard Brian Stevenson talk was a few years ago, and I was like, there are for-profit prisons? And I like freaked out, and I was like talking about how terrible it was that this guy has for-profit prisons, and my friend who's a woman of color was like, those have been here the whole time. Like the whole time. And I was like, well, that should stop. But but we shouldn't have those. But
They sat us together for a minute.
yeah, I know. But it's now we see where we as a culture are keeping people down. But now I think some of us, not all of us, obviously the country's still like 50-50, but some people, like I've never been to a protest in my life, and now it's like my pastime, you know? And it's being able to come together and fight alongside each other and say, also, I'm sorry that it took me this long to see that you guys have been going through this your whole lives, and I never even knew about it.
Yeah, I would just add, like, this is why I think with technology and our studies of like meta trends in technology, one of the things right now is because technology affords us a channel through which we can create extreme views, it's hard to figure out what's real or not online. And I think we need voices like Xavier and others on the panel, because we need some people who are actually doing the research and the work and giving us good information. And it's hard to like even trust like things that look like a news site. It's really not a news site, and they have other intentions behind it. And so we are a little bit disadvantaged nowadays from the fact that you can just start up and create tons of seemingly research that's not justified in anything, that create extreme views where it's us against them. And what I appreciate this morning was just kind of hearing everybody is that, you know, when you start articulating so well, better than I, a lot of what we're talking about is I need to hear more voices like that, so that minimally, if I'm in like a corporate setting or a startup setting, I can say, hey, you got to listen to Xavier. So we got to start like referring each other to actually people who are speaking truth. And we'll get there. But, you know, yeah, there's a lot of information out there. Just make sure, word of caution, that it's the right, you know, true information.
Can I piggyback? So
Yeah.
specifically about how has it changed the conversation? How has the political how's the political environment affected the conversation on race? And I want to dovetail deeply into the workplace and how it is. I see it changing the workplace conversations. We have to step back to see why we have. Again, going back to why is pain a classroom, right? So the election of Trump was an epiphany for people who never really listened to black folks, right? The reality is that DEI fundamentally at its core is about the commodification and reorganization of credibility in institutions. Credibility is a currency. Credibility allows you access to jobs. Credibility allows you to be considered for advancement. Credibility allows you to microaggress someone and not have retaliation in the meeting. Right? Credibility is currency. And DEI is about reestablishing and reorganizing the currency of credibility in the workplace. Credibility makes your pain not only perceivable, but believable. That's part of the challenge. And so when we're thinking about what did an election do to create credibility for something that was always present and never worthy of focus? This is what the election did. It reorganized the urgency that people who are not holding certain marginalized identities, and I want to include people like Standing Rock did for those who are immigrants, who we operate under this false narrative of we are a nation of immigrants. I am not an immigrant. I am imported. There is a difference. There are people who are not immigrants. They are indigenous. And Standing Rock created an epiphany moment for people who believed a narrative that other people had already been talking. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is A People's History of the United States. They had never read these types of books, and so they didn't know that there are indigenous scholars. And they never had to, because there were not sufficient stakes to be educated out of the violence they didn't know they were perpetuating. And so this election was an opportunity to reorganize the conversation around credibility, the conferral of access, and the right to safety. When you layer on top of that the intersectional realities of race in America, then we get hyper-specific, but you end up with certain externalities like what you're talking about, being fourth wheel. where you have this black-white conversation, because that's the unreconciled credibility conversation in America, that where we talk about now it's diversifying, and I have conversations with black people, that's still a racial conversation, and they're saying focusing on these indigenous people is diluting the conversation. I'm like, bruh, what? Like, we're arguing for affordable housing. They're still arguing for land without housing. It ain't Oppression Olympics. But, yo, I'd rather be like me than that. Like, I'd rather be in this situation than that situation. Regardless, how do I develop the ability to hold the tension that's required to live in a diverse environment and have the right to it because I'm committed to accountable relationship? How do I have the emotional dexterity to persist? The election was a demand, was a clear invitation. I won't say a demand, but it was a clear invitation to people who had sat in tolerated environments of public policy, communal, social, and economic harm that they were perhaps unwillfully, unknowingly, but on the record, inflicting downstream for them to come higher, for them to believe people that had always been speaking, for them to go into the universities and change up their authors, because the authors that they had inherited didn't teach them about the thing they didn't know they were doing that now they want to press pause on because they feel icky about talking about it. That's what the election did. I'm really glad for that. It does, however, reaffirm the challenge I have every day of waking up and trying to believe the good and the hope and these things while seeing that people still demand pain as proof for the validity of the extension of not just life, dignity itself.
Thanks, Xavier. Awesome. Okay, this is going to be our last question before lunch, right here.
I want to bring some other folks into the conversation.
I want to repeat, or Martine, can you repeat the question into the mic so that everyone can hear you? Sorry, yeah, put you on blast.
Take this mic up.
So I was kind of saying, so that black and brown people don't have to do all the work, how can white people better bring their cousins along? And specifically, how much attention should we focus on them and their needs versus doing the work and hoping that they will follow?
All right, fine. The evidence of hope is measurable, right? So it starts there, understanding that the evidence of hope, how can we bring them along and hope that they do the work? You don't have to hope, you can see it. The evidence of will is established through the effect, right? In the same way that you say, hey, I'm a farmer. You ain't got no trees, you ain't got no crops, nothing. Talking about I'm a farmer. Like, the evidence of what you hope for should be evident in the effect of what you said you were bringing into the world. The challenge is, how do you create an accountable conversation again? So if you try to create accountability after something is done, then everybody will argue to say that whatever I did was sufficient. This is what I'm saying around these DEI definitions. We wait until after the definition is in the book to defend our right to create something mediocre. It should come on the front end, the accountability with your cousins, right? What would it take? So for instance, I have people who say like, look, X, you be ranting. Right, you be like ranting online, you rant in your keynotes, you rant in your company, your employees got to deal with this after 5 o'clock. Like, I have my after 5 moments sometimes with my team. But the reality is that that's done to create a consistent level of urgency around people so that they know what it means to be friend to me. Let me dig into that a little bit. Some people you just have to be next to for them to call you a friend. I have 2 rules for my friends. You have to care about my life, and you cannot make more work for me. Those are the only 2 rules. Those are the only 2 things. Care about my life. Care about my life. My life means I'm a prison abolitionist. You have to have an opinion about money bail. You're not off the hook. Care about my life, and don't make any more work for me. So when you choose where you live, understand the public policy effects of segregation. When you choose where you work, stand up for the people who haven't not only not been heard, but have been silenced. right? That's accountability. Going to get your cousins means nothing if you don't have a framework for accountability to evaluate the effect of your conversation with them. It will leave you feeling hopeless. It will leave you feeling as if you've exhausted yourself for something that had no ability to return the investment that you put into it. And so love to yourself starts with understanding that accountability for them to people they may not know comes from your accountability of them to the people they already do. The work of DEI also is about introducing people to people they didn't know they weren't choosing. Folks think that they're all, yeah, I care about black folks, I care about brown folks, my Asian friend, Charles. Like, that happens all the time. That doesn't mean I care about your life. That doesn't mean I'm accountable for the effects that has on you. That doesn't mean that I sit down and talk to you, be like, yo, when I think about voting and this black-white binary, what's actually the best thing I can do at this next board meeting, this shareholders meeting, let's say, about creating more space for people of Asian descent to have a space in this conversation? We're still not even talking about jobs. We're just saying space in the convo. Right? Accountability for jobs is a different conversation. It's a different level of love. It's a different level of depth. It's more accountable. But again, sort of what you were saying, you can't do that work with them unless you can't do that work about them unless you do it with them, which means I have to actually go to someone. I have to be proximate. That's the accountability. Don't go get your cousins if you don't know how to hold them accountable to you, which means you have to be a visible measure of what accountability looks like, which means that in order for you to lead them, you have to be leading in your own life.
That's good. Yeah.
I'll just say really quick. Just to kind of co-sign on that, I think it's just important for us to do our own work, right? And it's in little ways, like, what are the thoughts that I'm having in being in this all-black space? What is my body telling me? What are the feelings that I'm having? Because I think a lot of times we ignore that, what's going on in our mind and our subconscious, what are we feeling viscerally in our bodies. And if you're just super intentional about doing your own work every single day, people will see it. People will see it. When you interject yourself in that conversation, said, that didn't feel good what you just said. Or I just hung out with my girlfriend Lakeisha and we went and had lunch. We know what color Lakeisha is, right? And then people are saying, well, Martine's got a black girlfriend? They go to lunch? Where'd you eat? Was it good? Right? So, I mean, it's simple, right? But just kind of paying attention to what's going on in your own mind and in your own body, and doing the work for yourself every single day, people will see it. People will see it. You don't have to tell them. They're just going to see how you operate in your life and how you show up.
My cousins,
Todd,
all the Todds. It's so strange. There's a lot of Todd Lopeses running around.
Hashtag shut up, Todd.
They don't see it, and I don't. What I've had to realize for myself, Thanksgiving is no longer about rest. We're going home and we're going to work. My brothers and I have this tradition that one of my brothers is in the Marine Corps, and so when he comes home, we all go out to dinner. It is not just dinner anymore. And for me and my family, many of them are kind of in and around the South, some from up north. I don't think it really matters. Systemic racism doesn't work that way, right? It's not just geographical. And when I go home, I have 2 little daughters that I hope that they grow up in a different world than I grew up in, right? I hope they learn things sooner than I learn things. It's not just shut it off and relax around these people who you used to be able to relax around. Because what I realized pretty quickly is they're saying things that make me uncomfortable now. I suspect they've always been saying them. Right? And now I just have to figure out, what am I going to do about it? And my wife is very gracious because she can just be there and hold her tongue. I just don't do that. I'm not going to do that. And so Thanksgiving for me, we usually get the whole family together, 30 plus people, right? I'm like, conversations are going to come up. And I've just surrendered the fact that I get to just sit by anymore. My uncle had quoted Morgan Freeman and he was talking about how, Morgan Freeman became successful and therefore, America's equal, right? My wife gets up, right? She starts walking away. I'm kind of leaning a little bit, right? I'm like, we can't just have that. That can't just be a thing that you say, period. My family, we were all hanging out at the boat with my brothers. This is a brother thing. My brother had made some comment about, he's in the construction industry, right? He made subtle, seemingly, right? Today, I would call that a microaggression. And I'm like, dude, what did you just say? Right? And my wife was like, stop, come on. Like, we're just having a good time, right? Like, yes, I'm enjoying this. This needs to happen. I went on a road trip with my dad to Charleston. Love my dad, great guy. He's been a teacher in the public school system for 30 years. And I was like, hey, I need to talk to you about something. What's up? My brother said this the other day. I mentioned by name. What do you think of that? No, he didn't say that. He did. Why is that startling to you? God, I don't think he meant it that way. We had a 3-hour ride to Charleston. But what was great was all of those moments invited a conversation that now is not over, right? But yeah, there's a big part of, I would like to believe that they could just watch what's going on and learn something. White people are too stubborn for that. I'm too stubborn for that, quite frankly, right? Stuff's been going on me for years. Just doing the thing, right? And so, yeah, I would say I'm not advocating that this is everyone's solution. This is just my solution. Family time is no longer just time to let your guard down. And I can live with myself with that, right? With that approach. But then it's forced me to go back and be like, I didn't say that right. That wasn't right. Or like, I just bit his head off. Now he's not going to talk about anything like that around me anymore, which that isn't the solution either, right? I just want to shut him down, because he's not going to stop thinking it. And so how do we go about this in a way and seek to bring our cousins along, my cousins, right, in a way that doesn't just discourage them from talking about the things they're thinking, but how do we begin a conversation that shifts the way that we are thinking? And I think that makes meaningful impact, but it does not mean, like, vacations are no longer the same with people like that, so.
All right, thanks to all of you. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters.